Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Industry Week webcast, Manufacturing 2021, 4 Industry Trends to Watch and 3 Smart Moves to Make, sponsored by Ultra Consultants and Sage. My name is Peter Freddy, Technology Editor with Industry Week. Before we begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First, if at any time you're having audio difficulties or slides are not advancing, pressing your F5 key will refresh the webcast console. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the Help button to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the Maximize icon or by dragging the lower right corner to enlarge the window. We do welcome your questions during today's event. Please use the Q&A window on the left side of your screen to submit questions to our presenters. We will answer as many questions as possible following the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time and we will add them to the queue. Also, we are recording today's session and you will receive an email when the archive is available on the Industry Week website. Please note the Ultra Consultants and the Sage logos are both hot linked. If you would like to visit their websites during the webcast, you can click on the logo and a new window will open. This will not take you out of the webinar. I would now like to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Dave Lechleitner, Senior Consultant at Ultra Consultants. Dr. Christopher Keel, Managing Director and Co-Founder with Armada Corporate Intelligence. And Mike Stein, Product Marketing Manager at Sage X3. Welcome, gentlemen. Dave, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter, for that warm introduction. And it's great to be participating again in an Industry Week webinar. For those of you on the call today that may not be familiar with Ultra Consultants, permit me just a minute or so to share a bit about our company and what we actually do. This year marks Ultra's 26th year in operation. We focus on assisting North American mid-market manufacturing and distribution companies better meet operational, market, and customer demands. We do that by providing business process assessment and improvement services, technology selection guidance, technology implementation, and project management services to our clients that wish to transform their operations. We are 100% ERP independent and ERP agnostic. So our team really becomes an integral part of your organization. We work shoulder to shoulder with you and your team to ensure that your business processes are optimized and should the need arise that your technology selection and implementation projects deliver the greatest value for your investment. In the past 26 years, our consultants have served as trusted advisors for a wide variety of companies across many manufacturing and distribution verticals, and we've helped these and other organizations align their internal and external processes to industry best practice. Our expertise is helping companies navigate what can be sometimes a very complex transformational journey. Ultra helps companies manage these transformation projects through 4 key phases. We kick off a typical project with business process assessment and improvement, which often leads to technology selection, then solution implementation, and finally value realization. The consistent thread throughout all of these phases and services that we provide is risk, change, and project management. Being a vendor independent consulting firm is important, I think, to you in a number of ways. First, we are your partner in guiding you through vendor education and selection. We help you get to know enterprise solution providers and implementation best practices that are best suited for your company and your unique project needs. We also partner with you in helping you to discover and uncover those improvements that we think can really maximize your investment in those solutions. So again, welcome everyone to our webinar today. The format today is actually a bit different for those of you that may have attended some of our webinars in the past. This afternoon for this webinar, we have a very special guest, Dr. Christopher Kuehl. I've met Dr. Kuehl on several occasions and have always found his perspective very thought-provoking and quite pertinent to manufacturing and distribution. He's able to distill very complex economic theory down to the salient points that are really most important for manufacturers and distributors. He and I will have a brief exchange during the first part of the webinar today, focusing on what we believe to be the 4 most impactful trends for 2021, especially those that are going to be affecting manufacturing and distribution companies. Then Mike Stein from Sage will give us his perspective on how to leverage technology in 3 important ways to potentially address these trends and challenges. So again, just as a quick review, we'll start first with our Q&A with Dr. Kuehl, and then we'll move quickly into getting Mike's perspective on the 3 technology moves to potentially address those trends and challenges. We'll then go ahead and open it up with a Q&A from the audience, so please do feel free to jot down those questions in that Q&A panel. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar. You know, the challenge, I think, for many of us as we kind of look into the crystal ball for 2021 is that there are likely dozens of things that we could be mindful of and maybe should be mindful of that might affect our day-to-day operations. So as we were all preparing for today's session, all of us presenters got together and did a bit of a brainstorming session and tried to boil some of those potential trends and challenges down to just 4 that are going to be likely the most impactful. So with that, let's go ahead and maybe talk a bit about the first trend and or challenge. So Dr. Kuehl, without a doubt, I think one can probably say that 2020 was unlike any year that any of us have experienced, at least in the past generation, if not our lifetime. The COVID pandemic obviously had a pretty devastating impact on many industries, most especially obviously the service industry, but we also saw some tremendous impact to manufacturing and distribution, especially on supply chains. So as we look at kind of this first possible trend or challenge for 2021, what do you think will be the lingering impact of the COVID pandemic and maybe most specifically its impact on supply chains?
Yeah, this was going to go down as the year that the just-in-time system died. I mean, for years and years, we were looking at that as the answer to our dreams, that we would no longer have to deal with all the inventory management and the stuff that we needed would just magically show up when we needed it. And then the whole system broke down in 2020. Where that is really affecting the industry is that now inventory is back. Now we're going to have to start wondering about the reliability of our supply chains. We are seeing them shift. China was the default for many companies because it was easy. We knew how to deal with China. They had the infrastructure. Everything was fine. Now all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, now I'm going to have to worry about dealing with India and Vietnam and Mexico and countries in Africa that I'm not even really sure where they are. So it's upset a system that was fairly routine. At one point, we had something like 40% of global cargo completely stalled. Even today, the auto industry is not in a position to produce the cars that are in demand because they can't get parts. They can't get chips. They can't, I mean, this whole system was so smooth and now is nothing close to smooth.
Wow, that's really, really insightful. Any thoughts on how we can kind of smooth some of the hills and bumps for 2021 at all?
Yeah, I think there'll be three different strategies, and you may get into these a little later in the seminar. But number one, of course, is diversifying, trying to find other producers, other sources other than those that we've been using in the past. That's been taking place for a number of years already. Number two is doing a lot more sourcing internally. There has been a bit of a movement back to nearshoring and reshoring, particularly companies that are now using more technology and more robotics instead of labor. The main reason that a lot of companies moved overseas was to take advantage of low labor costs, low production costs. Now companies can compete with those low-income countries with robotics and technology, and they are, and that's allowing companies to move production back closer to home. The more that you can have things within your own control, I mean, if you're sourcing from the United States, transportation is not as big an issue, command and control is not as big an issue, marketing is easier, management is easier, and then probably the third issue is back to that technology, and that is learning to use the advances that we now have in communications to be a lot more aware of that supply chain. It was something we took for granted for a long time, and it's now become a high priority, and we're going to have to be much more adept at how we use our logistics partners.
Well, that sounds really interesting. I know attending some of the manufacturing trade shows over the past few years, you know, the hot topic was definitely reshoring and definitely nearshoring. So it sounds like that's going to be, again, a potential critical consideration for 2021. Thanks for that insight.
Yeah, 2020 really accelerated that whole conversation.
Yeah. Well, you know, probably goes without saying, and, you know, the last 24 hours probably maybe even kind of fully illustrates the next point. You know, the second trend, obviously, I think we need to probably talk a bit about, and potentially the shift that this may cause is, you know, obviously the political landscape. Many of us, you know, probably back in November, kind of kept an eye on the election with some level of interest, maybe more interest than previous elections. And obviously in the last 24 hours, we've, most of us probably watched a bit of the inauguration of our new president on TV or social media. It seems, Dr. Keel, anytime there's this shift in power in Washington, especially now as we kind of look at this year, right? The houses, both houses of Congress and now the executive branch are going to be held by the same political party. I think it's been, almost a decade since that has happened. How do you think this shift or change in the political landscape is going to affect, especially manufacturing and distribution in 2021? I got to imagine that there's probably going to be a significant level of impact.
Yeah, there definitely will be. But one of the more interesting developments, because of the close nature of the Senate now, is that for the first time probably in 10, 15 years, we have a center that is going to have an extraordinary amount of power. Because you've got a dead tie, 50-50, it suddenly puts the sort of a handful of liberal Republicans and a handful of conservative Democrats in a very powerful position, because nothing is really going to happen without their support. So you're going to be looking at an expanded attention being focused on people like Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, kind of the moderate middle in the Republican side. On the Democratic side, you're going to be looking at more influence for people like John Tester and Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Those people together now hold the balance, and it's going to sort of temper both parties in a sense of what they try to accomplish. The biggest changes, I think, politically are likely to be trade-related. We were certainly going to see changes in regulatory authority. We're going to see changes in taxes. How much change is going to depend, again, on that center. But when it comes to trade, we're probably going to see a lot more activity with Europe. We're probably going to see a little bit more activity with Canada. Mexico, it's hard to tell because the government there is not very stable and the country is in bad economic shape. China is probably not going to change much at all. The democratic attitude towards China has always been pretty hostile. They have always been upset with human rights policies, their labor policies, their environmental policies. So it's not likely that there's going to be a boost in U.S.-China relations. If anything, it could get worse. And that goes back to the supply chain issue. We're going to be looking at more alternatives other than China. So I think we're early days. We don't yet really know what the Biden policies are going to be. They're saying all the right things when it comes to worrying about the labor supply and worrying about American competitiveness. And even when it comes to trade, his trade representative made it clear that the focus is going to be on U.S. jobs, kind of going after trade differently than we have in the past, saying we're not as interested in stopping imports as we are in expanding exports. So it's going to be the message of, if you want the U.S. to buy from you, you had better buy from us, or we're not going to do business with you. And that's kind of the German approach. I mean, that's what Angela Merkel has done for years, and it looks like we may start to try to copy that.
Interesting. Any guess on what might be Biden's kind of overarching tariff policy? Obviously, under Trump, we saw quite an emphasis on tariffs. Any guesstimate on what we might expect to see from Biden by chance?
We will probably see a little less emphasis on tariffs because when it comes right down to it, the tariff is a tax on the American company and the American consumer. I mean, the idea behind a tariff is simple, sort of, which is simply to make the import more expensive so that people will buy the domestically made product. Where it falls apart is when you don't really have a domestic alternative and you still have to buy the import, but now it's more expensive, which you then pass on to your consumer. The idea of emphasizing exports is basically saying, look, we're not going to tax ourselves to try to control our trade deficit. What we are going to demand is we have the market that the entire world wants access to. We are the consumers par excellence. We have leverage. If you want access to the U.S., well, then cooperate. If you don't want to cooperate, then don't be surprised if you don't have a lot of access. I think we will hold countries' feet to the fire when it comes to their trying to engage in dumping. You've already heard from the government that we're going to take a very dim view of currency manipulations. Janet Yellen, her very first speech was basically saying we are not going to tolerate currency manipulation, and we have lots of tools to punish countries like China if they try things like that. But I think the focus is going to be a little bit more on, you want access to us. To get that access, you need to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So speaking of the U.S. being the world's preeminent consumer, I think that's one of the other trends that we've sort of identified for 2021 as well. So let's maybe talk a bit about this whole shift potentially in consumer buying. Obviously, this is somewhat affected because of the pandemic, but could you provide us your perspective, Dr. Keel, on what you expect will happen in 2021 as it relates to consumer buying trends? I have to imagine that the shift that we saw, at least in 2020, is going to continue a bit into 2021, and we'll still have some impact on manufacturers and distributors.
Yeah, there's going to be an interesting point probably by midsummer. It's being referred to as the Great Divergence. One of the things we could not do in 2020 was spend on services, and that was something like 65% of our consumer spending was on services. And the more money you made, if you were in the upper 25% of income earners, you were spending 80% of your disposable income on services. Suddenly that was all cut off. So for a solid year, we were becoming goods buyers again. We were buying things. We were putting stuff in our houses. We were just trying to entertain ourselves because we couldn't go out and do it like we used to. By the summer, if you start to get these protocols loosening, we're going to be back to that service economy. Will we then revert? Will we go back to spending our money on restaurants and going to concerts and traveling? If we do, then it means we have less interest in those manufactured goods that we were buying so aggressively last year. So it could potentially be a little bit of a downturn for manufacturers who produce for that consumer sector. There may be, at least for a while, less interest in buying goods. On the other hand, there may be interest in buying goods that are connected to returning to the service economy. People in the apparel industry are saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if people actually wore shoes and socks again?
That's funny, but very true. Very true. So one of the points on the slide, as I'm kind of reading it, it sounds like there's going to be some pent up demand for travel, especially as well. I know some of our manufacturers on the call are probably in the aerospace and especially the aerospace supply chain. Any words of wisdom for those folks, and as it relates to travel kind of coming back, and again the economy opening up and letting us be able to travel again?
Yeah, the casual travel has started to come back to a certain degree already. We saw people willing to travel even in the heart of the epidemic last year during the holidays. The real crux is going to be the business community. Will they start traveling again? Will there be conferences and trade shows and all that stuff? That is probably going to be a little bit slower, but by most estimates, and very anecdotally, since I do a lot of speaking around the country, I'm noticing that there's a lot of confidence in being able to go back to those in June, July, even May. So that would tell me that the aerospace sector, the airlines, will start to see a lot more of that core business travel by the end of spring, early summer. Interesting.
Well, kind of the last point that I think is probably important to talk about is your prediction as it relates to job recovery. One of the challenges leading into 2020, especially for manufacturers, was they just could not find skilled labor to fill the job openings that they had, and again, we even saw that probably in spite of the COVID pandemic. What are your thoughts as it relates to job recovery for 2021, especially manufacturing jobs?
Yeah, manufacturing has exactly the same problem it had before the pandemic. The pandemic almost had no impact on manufacturing from a labor perspective. The majority of people who lost their jobs were in the service sector. Those jobs will come back pretty quickly because they are low point of entry jobs. But manufacturers are still dealing with the fact that, 40, 50 million people out of work, but we don't want to hire somebody who used to be a server at a restaurant to run a press break. We need skilled people. We need people who can handle this job. We're not training them. We're not training them fast enough. There was always this glib assumption that a manufacturer could just hire somebody and train them. They can't do that. It takes almost a year and a half before a new hire is productive. And, they all have the same experience. You hire Skippy and you turn to one of your experienced guys and say, I want you to train this guy. And your experienced guy looks back at you and says, you giving me any extra time, any extra money?
Right.
Are my productive quotas any different? You jerk. I don't want to train Skippy. Hire somebody who knows how to do the job, would you? So, that's the dilemma, and it's still there. And, nothing about this really changed that equation.
Yeah, interesting. Any indication that we're seeing from the new administration supporting various initiatives, skills training programs, anything like that that you might be able to share?
There's some talk. It's still early days. We don't really know where they're putting their emphasis, but there was discussion throughout the campaign that there was going to be orientation more towards trade schools, more towards training people for practical things. Even when they talk about trying to make education free, there's people saying, well, look, if you're going to educate people for free, for crying out loud, don't train them in ancient French literature, okay? Can you train them to work in the jobs that we need filled? And in that case, yeah, I can get behind that. I can get behind training people to run the industries that make this country money. I just want to get away from we're going to pay somebody money to party for 4 years. Right.
Interesting. Well, Dr. Keel, just kind of looking at our clock, we do at this point have to kind of cut off our discussion, and we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mike to share a bit about, kind of based on this conversation, what might be 3 smart moves and 3 smart investments that we should consider for 2021. So I think with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to Mike. And Dr. Keel, if you'd stay on the line, just in case we have a few questions at the end of the presentation today.
I'd be happy to.
Great.
Thank you, Dave. And before I cover the 3 smart moves, I'd like to give a brief overview of Sage and Sage X3. For those of you who are not familiar with Sage, we're a global organization that publishes a diverse portfolio of software solutions that manage things like accounting, HR, construction, and enterprise systems, to name a few that are offered in the cloud, on-premise, or both. We're supported by a powerful ecosystem, and what I mean by that is we work with an extensive network of partners who contribute to our mutual growth and our ambition to build customers for life. We also have upwards of 500 independent software vendors, or ISVs as we call them, who add further functionality and vertical customization. And we have dozens of strategic alliances with some of the biggest names in technology. Now let's quickly look at Sage X3. Sage X3 is an enterprise solution that provides faster, more intuitive, and tailored business management solutions than conventional ERP. And when we say faster, I'm referring to faster process cycle times, faster inventory turns, faster customer response time, and faster insight into cost and performance. Intuitive means the better management of distributed operations, easier access to data and collaboration, and simpler IT management. And tailored speaks to our various deployment options, flexible capacity, flexible configuration, and customization and evolution. And finally, Sage X3 is designed for organizations looking to thrive and retain their competitive advantage by increasing their agility, embracing change at speed. All right, let's move into the 3 smart moves by talking about adapting to new business models. So when I think of the notion of changing a business model, I'm referring to the fact that most organizations plan for disruptions to resources and processes, but they don't necessarily recognize that business models can be just as big a threat to the continuity of their operations. For example, companies have been dealing with this for the last decade as the growth of e-commerce has changed their path to market. But for most companies, this has been a gradual change that has given them time to test and study. The key is to ensure that their business model is as resilient to outside disruptions as it is to the rest of the business. That said, organizations need to assess critical IT infrastructure and software systems by defining their current business model, identifying uncertainties and potential business disruptors, assessing the impact, designing changes, and executing those changes. And of course, modern technology plays a critical role in this. A major piece of this is their various channels they leverage in their operations. I've been seeing firsthand how a number of organizations that have traditional channels such as retail, wholesale, DSD, you name it, that have now been looking heavily into e-commerce solutions due to the pandemic, as I mentioned previously, but at greater speed. This is more than having an e-commerce capability, though. And as you can imagine, this can be a very strategic and uncharted course that requires trusted advisors that can help them to rapidly implement a solution to make up for lost ground. As I said, we're actually seeing this firsthand. And with one of our customers, Once Upon a Farm, who manufacture organic cold-pressed snacks for kids that are based in the San Diego area. Their primary channel has been grocery stores, all the major chains. But with the pandemic, combined with certain restrictions to their previous systems, decided to upgrade to a more modern ERP combined with e-commerce. So as you can imagine, that's quite an effort. But with the help of one of our partners, we were able to accomplish the implementation rather quickly. From a Sage X3 perspective, we helped them with a strong system that is audible, traceable, and has quality control. It provides one system of truth, and it allows them to create and automate processes to grow without adding a lot of staff. And ultimately, Sage X3 helped them accomplish an omni-channel type of distribution and quickly pull back from just retail. Another smart move is the need to build a strong foundation. So I'd like to move on to this notion of intelligent ERP. All right. Thanks to our friends at IDC, you're about to see how intelligent ERP actually becomes an enabler and strategic decision-making tool in the digital transformation journey. So I think we all know that ERP market is shifting, right? The truth of the matter is that organizations really need to stop investing in limited and oftentimes antiquated ERP solutions and start looking into more robust, innovative, responsive, and intelligent ERP system to address their challenges. This new generation of intelligent ERP, iERP, is the future of the business enterprise. The intelligence comes from more information and data, in-context learnings, and the application of the knowledge obtained to deliver better business outcomes. So if you look at the left side of your screen, you see the key characteristics of iERP, things like IoT in real time, common data pools, and adaptive user experiences. On the right, you see how manufacturing companies, for example, can optimize across all resources with iERP systems and applications. The business improves productivity, reduces additional layers of resources and employees, technology, and processes, and altogether improves its time to market, which we all know is a distinct competitive advantage. Now let's look at process manufacturing, for example. Holding the master data of all products, raw materials, and suppliers, ERP becomes the organizer of processes in manufacturing enterprises. The fundamental role of ERP is central to managing and recording formulation and recipes, executing quality control of batches, providing complex gravity calculations, streamlining production, and strengthening customer management. Other manufacturing technologies can benefit from the data ERP handles, including management execution systems, for example. So this is amplified by the fact that there are supporting technologies that enable seamless collaboration and foster decision-making, such as advanced analytics, AI-powered engines, which, for instance, can help manufacturers to model raw materials processing and take efficiency to a new level of accuracy. Looking at the graph, which is kind of an eye chart, you'll see how surrounding business applications and supporting technologies, an ecosystem, if you will, play a critical component of bringing this all together to create a comprehensive solution. And this is pretty much my favorite part. I'd just like to ask the audience a quick question. You know, how important is customization when evaluating an ERP? If you don't mind, please select one of the four, and I'll give it a minute or two to let you do that. And please hit submit once you've made your selection. And the reason I say it's one of my favorite parts is I'm on panels, I'm on roundtables, discussions with prospects and customers, and we oftentimes ask this question, and it's very interesting to see the results. Typically, they are coming in somewhat similar, but I'm just very curious to understand this audience's response. So let's take a look. Yeah, exactly. So 51.2%, very important. And the reason is, you know, software is software, and you need to be able to adapt it to your particular needs, be it industry or what have you. So it's not surprising, and that is the common response. So thank you all very much for doing that. It is indeed very important. So my final point on iERP is that of resiliency, meaning that in times of disruption, like we're in today, resilience is key to succeeding. Given the interconnected nature of today's global supply chain, an expansive network of production facilities, warehouses, and transportation hubs, manufacturing supply chains are more likely to encounter disruptions or breakdowns at more touch points across their supply network. For a business to be truly resilient and to be good at avoiding disruption, regardless of the form it takes, it's imperative that it first looks at its own practices and sets in place the appropriate policies, processes, and tools. For some, it may be about improving inventory performance. For others, it may be about visibility into mixed factory networks. And for still others, it may be about supplier diversification or even the reconfiguration of production. So now I'd like to share a bit of research we conducted, let it catch up, a bit of research we conducted a little while back that specifically looks at smart technology investments. We conducted research with manufacturers to find out what executives should be looking at in the future. In the US, UK, and Canada, manufacturers overall perceive that the chief benefit of investment in emerging technology is reduction of costs with increased visibility of the supply chain and the automation of repetitive tasks coming closely behind. Now, looking at the chart, the findings show that ERP is at the top of the maturity list. As a result, that was to be expected, quite honestly, given investments over the past 20 to 30 years. That said, our research also says that many manufacturers have embarked on their digital transformation journey and that executives must understand that competitors will already be working with a wide range of technologies at various levels of maturity. All right. Let's take a look here, make sure I'm caught up. Let's take a look at the future technology priorities for roughly the next 5 years. It isn't surprising to see many manufacturers with ERP tools in maturity. 92% of manufacturers use some kind of ERP solution, considered a necessity to bring together the most important functions across people and process and to connect the factory floor to the front office. Manufacturing executives should also watch an ongoing shift towards emerging technologies, with AI, automation, robotics, and even blockchain already in use or with plans to be used in the near future. And Industry 4.0 is more than a concept. We've been talking about it for a while, with a large majority of manufacturers choosing to take advantage of the gains it can make in terms of productivity and efficiency, even if it does require significant investment, to be quite honest. So clearly, the future is not just about reducing cost. It's about creating value in new ways. And just as importantly, getting the mix of new technologies and what's required to manage them right. So to wrap this up, we know that companies are looking for every opportunity to get ahead, and they should continue to focus on their ERP solutions as a key step in improving their business operations. Best-in-class companies are establishing the proper solutions for their ERP in order to meet the mounting pressures placed upon them. And then finally is, just want to say that we're all in this together. In these challenging times, we want to ensure that we provide companies with the visibility, flexibility, and efficiency to better manage their finances, operations, and people, freeing them from the burden of admin so they can spend more time doing what they love. Whether you're opening back for business, expanding a channel like Once Upon a Farm did, need to stay on top of your cash flow when you need it most, make decisions with confidence for what comes next, or just get the insights you need to help you get back to business, we're here to help. So with that, Dave, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Awesome, Mike. Thanks so much for that really useful insight and your perspective from the technology and ERP vendor side of the world. It's always really interesting to kind of see what's and hear from you folks, just to understand what's sort of top of mind and what's on your mind as you develop and add functionality to your solutions. So really quickly, just to sort of wrap up our conversation today, we had what I would characterize as a really sort of fluid and great interaction with Dr. Keel, really positioning the first part of the webinar, hopefully with the 4 challenges, the 4 trends, the 4 things that should be top of mind for all of us in 2021. We talked a bit about global supply chains and how the pandemic definitely in 2020 affected those supply chains and how they're going to start coming back potentially in the first half of 2021. We talked a bit about, how various political policies, trade policy in particular, and some of the other potential impacts of the new administration on manufacturing and distribution in 2021. We talked a bit about consumer buying trends and how they definitely changed in 2020 and will somewhat normalize again back in 2021, and then obviously talked a bit about job recovery, and then again just a quick review. Mike talked a bit about how businesses in 2021 are going to have to continue to adapt to new business models. We hear that a lot. You need to be agile. You need to be resilient. It's really going to be important, almost goes without saying, that you want to make the right technology investments and really maximize those investments. And smart technology is definitely one of those things on the forefront that we all should be considering going forward. I know there was a lot of activity in the Q&A panel, so I think at this point we're going to turn it back over to Peter to sort of facilitate the Q&A part of today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Excellent presentation. And yes, we do have a number of questions, so we're going to jump right in. A reminder, as presenters are answering questions, please take a moment to complete the feedback form on the left side of the lower toolbar. All right, first question here. How is the market stratified for small versus large companies?
In terms of how the investors are looking at it, or how we think the market will behave going forward? I mean, that's kind of the crux of the situation. Investors right now are sitting on a tremendous amount of money. The estimate is around $3.5 to $4 trillion available for investment. And the weight has been mostly political. They wanted to know what was going to be going on with Congress. Now that that's settled, that money is beginning to make its way into the stream. A lot of it's going to be oriented towards merger and acquisition activity, but there's also going to be a certain amount of catching up when it comes to getting more machinery and doing whatever sort of physical plant change that it needs to happen. The markets right now are very strong, but that's somewhat predicated on coming out of the 2020 recession robustly. If we stay on course, I think the markets will stay healthy throughout the year. If there are big inhibitions, you might see some dips. No big corrections, but kind of stalls for a few weeks until things calm down.
All right, great. Next question here. When based on risk, should a supplier undergo some kind of evaluation to determine if they can provide an item or service?
Probably. I mean, what we're dealing with now is a lot of unknowns. We don't really know a lot of these new suppliers. We don't have a lot of experience with them. As I mentioned in the conversation, I work with the National Association for Credit Management, and it's a whole new world for them because they're all of a sudden dealing with companies they've not dealt with before. So yeah, I would very definitely go through some kind of a process to figure out who you're dealing with, how reliable they are. That might almost be something that my colleague can address more aggressively than I, because I think that falls right into that conversation of having a system to protect you.
Yeah, and I would just jump in. This whole concept of evaluation. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, sorry about that. I wasn't sure if someone else wanted to jump in there. I think that is one of the kind of key takeaways I think from the presentation today. Not just because there's a lot of still unknowns yet for 2021, but just this whole concept that I think both manufacturers and suppliers within the supply chain. You know, it's going to be really important to kind of get in that sort of regular habit of formalized self-evaluation, right? What is our core competency? Is what we did last year going to take us into 2021, 2022? So, you know, business process assessment, core competency assessment, supplier evaluation, I think all of those things are going to be really, really key going forward. Mike, I don't know if you have any other additional comments on your side regarding that?
No, I think your feedback and the doctor's was spot on, so I really have nothing to add to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a matter of trusting your partners. When it comes to figuring out new supply chains, you're going to be going to your transportation providers and asking for them to sort of step up and help you understand who you're dealing with, because you can evaluate whether the supplier can produce what it is you need, but then you're going to have someone saying, can they do it on the timeline that you want it? Is there reliability? How are you going to get paid? So it's going to be time to reach out to people saying, look, if you want to be my provider, my banker, you need to help me here. And that's going to be a lot of conversation this year.
Totally agree.
Great. Next question here. Are investors going to take interest in startups?
Probably. I mean, that's been the hint, that a lot of this money is sitting on the sidelines waiting for people to kind of see how the dust settles. There's an acknowledgement that things have changed sufficiently that there's opportunities. You've already seen a lot of it when people started shifting heavily to online. I mean, we were doing maybe 10 to 15% of our purchases online when this started. It's now close to 40%. So startups that are involved with warehousing or with transportation or with just expediting that kind of online activity are going to be very popular. I think there's going to be a lot of activity around kind of replacing some of the manufacturing traditions that had been sufficient before and aren't now. So that onshoring, reshoring opportunity is going to be playing a huge role. I think people forget that manufacturing in the U.S. is a small business concern. 75% of manufacturers in the U.S. have 25 employees or less. So these are little companies, and they are frequently interested in community banks and small investors and angel investors and people that just want to back them as they get into a particular niche.
All right, great. Next question here. What are your thoughts about the semiconductor manufacturing industry? It's a little bit different than other manufacturing as the demand and customers are different.
Yeah, it's been one that's been hit. I mean, I mentioned earlier that the automotive sector is still trying to deal with a shortage of chips. This is a sector that we have really depended heavily on Asian producers, and now we're wondering if that's a place we want to be. I think the semiconductor industry has been on an upward track for a long time. That's certainly not going to slow down, not with the increased role of robotics and technology. So it's a very volatile industry, but it's not an industry that's easy to get into. So a company that just suddenly decides to become a chip maker is kind of facing a little bit of an uphill battle. The demand always seems to exceed supply. I mean, right now it certainly has. So the auto sector is screaming for chips. Can't even deliver the cars that have been ordered because they're waiting for the stuff to come in.
All right. Next question here. Do you think increasing the minimum wage to $15 will hurt recovery?
You know, it probably won't, because it always has baffled me a little bit that this has been such a conversation topic. 2.3% of the entire U.S. workforce earns minimum wage or below. 2.3%. It's a very, very small number of people. even $15 an hour is a very small slice. Most manufacturers are looking at this like, yeah, I'd love to be able to pay somebody $15 an hour. My guys make a lot more than that. And I think the real impact from the minimum wage will be on the service sector. It will be a little bit of a boon for people who are currently not making a lot of money. But we know from experience that two things happen. One, if you keep your job, you're in good shape. You're going to get a little bit more money. But about half the people who are working for minimum wage don't keep their job. The company says, well, you know, I was willing to pay you $8, $10 an hour. I'm not going to pay you 15. You know, what often happens is they go out and hire somebody else at 20 bucks an hour and fire all the minimum wage workers. It's kind of like, if I'm going to pay that much money, I'm going to go find an experienced person that can do twice what you do. So it's a little bit of a winners do well, losers do much worse. And it's not quite the panacea. It kind of comes back to training. The real issue is helping people make a living that they can raise a family on. And with millions of jobs offered in manufacturing that pay very well, quit messing with minimum wage and train these people to take those jobs.
Great point. Next question here. How prominent of a role does ESG play in supply chain management going forward?
I think this is one for Mike.
Yeah, could you please repeat that?
Sure. It's how prominent of a role does ESG play in supply chain management moving forward?
You know, that's a really great question, actually. And to be quite honest, I would like whomever asked this question to reach out to me one-to-one. We'll be showing my contact information here in a few minutes, but if you don't mind, please reach out to me one-to-one, if you don't mind.
All right, great. Let's see. Next question here is, can China hold USA ransom with pharma products since they do most of the production?
Yeah, I think there's a certain threat of this, but one of the interesting things about China is that many of the businesses there really depend on the U.S. market and the European market. So whenever the Chinese talk about kind of using their productive strength as leverage, the consumers come back and say, well, yeah, you know, but if you don't want to sell it to us, somebody will, and we're the ones who are buying it. So what you're seeing a lot in pharma is a same kind of supply chain distribution that you're seeing in a lot of other sectors. Other countries are picking up on this. The biggest threat to the Chinese when it comes to pharma is India. And the Indians have hated the Chinese for generations. And they're like, well, if you don't want to make these drugs, we will. And you're also starting to get some competition even coming from Latin America and from Africa, believe it or not. So that's always been the rub. You know, it doesn't feel like it, but the consumer rules. Somebody will produce something if somebody is willing to buy it. And as long as the U.S. is interested in the product, and we are, then there'll be a producer. And there may be lags. There may be a period where, you know, the Chinese are trying to use their leverage, and it takes a while for the Indians to catch up, but not long. And we've already seen a huge shift in pharma emphasis to India, and I think that's going to accelerate.
All right, great. Another question here. Are there any potential factors that could drastically change the projections for economic recovery?
Yeah, there's probably three, and they're pretty obvious. Number one would be that something happens that slows down the recovery from the virus. I mean, if we get a mutation that doesn't respond to the vaccine, if the vaccine doesn't get distributed the way we thought, that slows things down dramatically. Number two, the consumer does not return to their old ways. All the polls indicate that we're champing at the bit and we want to get back to what we used to do, but we'll see. I mean, if we get a situation where people are still cautious and still nervous and don't resume their old behaviors, then we don't get the growth we thought we were going to get in the middle of the year. And then probably the third thing, which is a little more obscure, would be reacting to the challenge in other countries. We still have a need to import product from the developing world. They are not doing very well as far as getting control of COVID-19. The next crisis really is shifting to Latin America, Africa, part of South Asia. We don't have the dependence, we, the United States, that other countries do on those regions, but it's still significant. We rely on exports for 15% of our GDP. So those would be the three threats. I mean, it would be a reversal when it comes to the COVID-19 virus. It means consumers reluctant not to get back to their old ways. And then thirdly, interruptions with some of the trade that we do with the developing world.
All right. Got a question here. It's sort of a follow-up to the minimum wage question before. Wouldn't the new minimum wage push other wages upward, almost like a domino effect?
It tends to, and it depends a little on the business. You've got a lot of companies where you already have workers that are making $15, $16 an hour. And if a new person comes in making that same money, they'll turn back to the company and say, hey, look, I used to make $6, $7 more than the new hire. I want that to happen again. But what is often the case is that businesses are striated, where you have lower paid workers and then there's a big jump to the next level. So the person who's making 25 or 30 bucks an hour is not really going to feel too threatened by the guy that's now suddenly making 15, depending on sort of how the company is using this new worker. Many of the minimum wage jobs, if not most of them, are still in the service sector, and there's not a lot of upward mobility there at all. I mean, there's always been a huge drop between people who are sort of quasi-management experienced workers and the people coming in at minimum wage. So that gap will still be there, and I don't think you're going to get a tremendously inflationary reaction to increased minimum wage. You haven't so far in the states that have done minimum wage, and part of it is that you just don't have that many people that it affected. I mean, it always is presented like, tens of millions of Americans are making minimum wage. It's 2.3% of a 70, 80 million person workforce. So it's kind of like, yeah, the guy at the chicken shack is getting more money. I don't know that that's going to change my world much unless, of course, they start charging more for the sandwich.
Okay. Another question here. Do current economic projections take into account Biden's proposed plan to create millions of manufacturing jobs in the U.S.?
They're trying to, but at this point we don't quite know what that's going to look like. So it hasn't been factored in thoroughly. The studies that I've seen are sort of intimating that if you really do see a dramatic expansion in manufacturing jobs, that it would have a pretty positive effect on the economy as a whole. But everyone is sort of waiting to see what the details are. How does he plan to do that? There's always been this notion that you just have to open up the jobs and the first 100 people that walk in the door, congratulations, you're working in manufacturing. The manufacturers are saying, look, we've had these jobs for 20 years. I talked to manufacturers that said, it took me 4 years to find a welder. I've got the job. I don't have the person who can take it. So you're kind of going back to the new administration saying, the jobs are there. You need to find a way to prepare people to take them. So if your plan involves funding trade schools and getting community college support and bringing industrial arts back to high school, right now, 6% of high schools in the United States still have industrial arts. 6%. So at some point we need to turn to the educational system and saying, would you please recognize that these are legitimate careers that pay a lot of money, and you need to start educating kids so that they don't all think that they have to design computer websites, that they can program robot welding arms if they like computers.
All right, great. Actually, it looks like we've run out of time here. I would like to thank all of our speakers, Chris, Dave, Mike, as well as our sponsors, Ultra Consultants and Sage. On behalf of Industry Week, have a productive remainder of the day.